9 minutes of suffocating silence. Not a sound, not a breath. Just a girl from the Bronx staring down America's highest court, her gaze sharp enough to cut marble. In a chamber where justice cowers behind velvet drapes and power whispers from the shadows, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez fixed Sonia Sotomayor, the so-called conscience of the court. With eyes so unflinching, they tore open decades of sacred, untouchable silence. And everyone felt it. Something unstoppable was about to erupt. The Supreme Court had never felt this quiet, not even during landmark rulings when the entire nation waited on a single word. The chamber seemed alive, as if the towering marble columns had grown ears. Stained glass windows cast fractured colors onto the dark wooden benches, the light shifting like restless spectators. The air was dense, heavy with the weight of centuries of precedent, unspoken rules, and untouchable authority. Reporters adjusted their cameras, lenses clicking softly, some whispering to each other. "She's not supposed to be here," one said under his breath, his voice barely audible over the faint hum of the ventilation system. "This isn't going to end well." But their eyes never left the figure moving slowly down the center aisle. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, blazer white as chalk, hair pinned back with precision, her heels tapping against the marble floor in a rhythm too deliberate to be casual. Every step echoed as if each sound carried a challenge. It wasn't just an entrance, it was a declaration. She carried a thick folder pressed against her chest, and for a moment, even seasoned legal analysts, people who had covered 1,000 hearings, forgot to breathe. Up on the high bench, Justice Sonia Sotomayor shifted her gaze, her expression unreadable. Her hands folded, fingers twitching ever so slightly. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "This isn't a place for speeches, Congresswoman." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They slid across the room like a blade. AOC didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She reached the podium and placed the folder down with a calm precision. Papers rustled. Pens paused mid-sentence. She looked up at the justices, not just at Sotomayor, but at every pair of eyes staring down at her. Her voice, when it came, was low but carried an edge that made people sit straighter. "This isn't about speeches, Your Honor. It's about survival." A ripple moved through the room. Someone in the gallery exhaled too loudly and quickly clasped their hands in their lap. A clerk at the corner of the room stopped typing for the first time in 30 minutes. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, a city unaware of the history unraveling inside its most sacred legal chamber. Sotomayor's lips pressed into a line, her jaw tightened. The faint tapping of her pen on the bench began, slow, methodical, like a clock counting down to something inevitable. 1, 2, 3 taps. AOC had adjusted the microphone, her fingers steady despite the pounding in her chest. The room seemed to contract, drawing every heartbeat, every shallow breath into its center. Even Chief Justice Roberts, who rarely betrayed emotion, tilted his head slightly, as if seeing the young Congresswoman for the first time. This wasn't a scheduled testimony. This wasn't part of the plan. And yet here she was, standing on the same marble tiles that had borne witness to arguments shaping the very fabric of American life. In the back row, a law student clutched her notebook tightly, whispering to her friend, "What the hell is she doing? She's going to get destroyed." But her eyes were wide with something else, admiration, maybe even hope. AOC's gaze swept across the chamber again, lingering on the portraits of justices past. Men, mostly, a few women. None of them looked like her. None of them had grown up in a Bronx apartment where heat was a luxury and eviction notices came like seasons. "Today isn't about tradition," she continued, her voice firming. "It's about the millions whose voices hang by a thread, voices this court has the power to save or erase." Sotomayor's tapping stopped. Dead silence. For a moment, it seemed as if the walls themselves were leaning in, waiting. AOC inhaled, feeling the full weight of 1,000 cameras, thousands of watching eyes far beyond this room. Somewhere in America, a woman washing dishes in a cramped kitchen might pause to listen. A young immigrant walking home from class might stop scrolling his phone. A retired factory worker in Ohio might frown at his television, unsure how to feel about this young congresswoman standing in the belly of the highest court. This wasn't the usual theater of politics. It felt sharper, riskier. Sotomayor finally spoke again, her voice clipped, deliberate. "You're here on borrowed time, Congresswoman. Make it count." It wasn't permission, it wasn't approval, but it wasn't an expulsion either. AOC's lips curved, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement. She placed both hands on the podium, steady now, her pulse aligning with the quiet drumbeat of anticipation in the room. Somewhere behind her, a reporter whispered, "She's going to light this place on fire." And nobody disagreed. The chamber didn't exhale, not after AOC's words, not after the slight but unmistakable ripple she had sent through a room used to being unshaken. Justice Sotomayor had stopped tapping her pen, though her fingers still rested lightly on it, as if debating whether to resume the metronome of tension. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez straightened her shoulders slightly. There was no turning back now. "This isn't theoretical," she began, her voice measured yet threaded with something deeper, something raw. "Henderson versus Texas isn't just about lines on a map. It's about lives, millions of them." Her eyes swept across the bench. "This court's decision will decide whether entire communities disappear, not from the census, but from democracy itself." A young law clerk in the corner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The phrase hung heavy, laced with implications that dared even the justices to deny. Chief Justice Roberts' expression remained stoic, but the brief flicker of his eyes toward Sotomayor didn't go unnoticed. AOC continued, this time her voice softening. "I met a woman in my district last year, Rosa Santiago, 67 years old. She stood in line for 6 hours in the Bronx to vote in her local election. 6 hours on swollen feet, holding her grandson's hand, clutching her ID like a lifeline. And when she reached the front, the poll worker told her, a pause. Her district no longer existed." Someone in the gallery let out a sharp breath. The sound echoed louder than expected. Justice Kavanaugh leaned forward slightly, pen poised but unmoving. Justice Barrett lowered her eyes, fingers tightening on her notes. The silence was brittle now, as though the wrong sound might fracture it. Then came the soft but distinct tap of Sotomayor's pen against wood. Once, twice, 3 times. Each one deliberate, each one like the second hand of a clock counting down to something unseen. "She's weaving a narrative," murmured Justice Alito to Sotomayor, his voice low but sharp. "She's dangerous. She's relatable." Sotomayor didn't answer. Her gaze stayed locked on AOC. There was no emotion there, or perhaps too many layered too carefully to see. AOC let the silence linger before stepping closer to the podium, her hands clasped in front of her. Her next words came out quieter, yet carried even further. "The Constitution doesn't belong to this bench alone. It belongs to the people. Rosa Santiago isn't a statistic. She isn't a legal footnote. She is the Constitution." Well, the words struck like a spark on dry tinder. A reporter's pen scratched furiously against paper, while another fumbled with his recorder, as if afraid to miss the exact cadence of her voice. Up in the gallery, a professor of constitutional law whispered to a colleague, "This isn't an argument anymore. This is a reckoning." Sotomayor's fingers had stopped their tapping, her hands now folded tightly, knuckles paling. The chamber's temperature felt different somehow, though no one moved to adjust it. Alexandria's eyes moved from one justice to the next, unwavering. Thomas, Kavanaugh, Barrett, Gorsuch, then finally back to Sotomayor. She held the older woman's gaze. Neither blinked. And in that moment, the air between them seemed to hum, not with anger, not even with open defiance, but with something far more complicated. Expectation, challenge, recognition. Then AOC spoke again, voice calm, deliberate, almost surgical in its precision. "With respect, Your Honors, when the right to vote is stripped from communities, it is not democracy. It is disenfranchisement dressed in legal robes." Justice Sotomayor tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing by a fraction. The room waited for her reply, but none came. Not yet. Somewhere near the back, a young man in a hoodie whispered to his friend, "She's tearing down the walls in here, brick by brick." The friend didn't answer. His phone was already recording. AOC let out a breath, slow and measured, as if resetting the tone of her own heartbeat. I stand here not because I seek conflict, but because millions have no one else to speak for them in this chamber. Justice Roberts shifted in his seat. Congresswoman, keep your comments to constitutional matters, he said evenly. But even he couldn't disguise the faint edge of curiosity in his tone. AOC inclined her head, her lips tugging at the faintest suggestion of a smile. The Constitution, Chief Justice, is made of more than text and precedent. It is built from the voices of the people it serves. Ignore them, and you hollow it out. Sotomayor's pen tapped again. Once. Then silence. She leaned forward slightly, her voice emerging low, tight. Your stories are powerful, Congresswoman. But this chamber is not a stage for anecdotes. It is a place for legal arguments. AOC met her gaze without hesitation. With respect, Justice Sotomayor, wasn't it your story, your mother's sacrifices, your life in the Bronx, that shaped your own understanding of justice? Are those not anecdotes too? There was no sound in the chamber now. Not a cough, not a shuffle, only the faint whirring of a distant camera lens focusing in. And for a fleeting second, some watching swore they saw the corner of Sotomayor's mouth twitch. Not in anger, but in something more ambiguous. Reflection, perhaps, or a hesitation she wasn't used to showing. AOC didn't press further. She didn't need to. The seed had been planted, and from the look in the justice's eyes, it was already taking root. The silence stretched, fragile and loaded, a moment balanced perfectly on the edge of transformation or collapse. And just as a reporter reached to type the next headline, AOC spoke again, her words sharp and deliberate. This isn't about me. It isn't even about Rosa Santiago. It's about whether this court still remembers who it serves to me. The chamber felt tighter now, the air somehow denser, as if holding its own breath along with everyone inside. Justice Sotomayor's pen no longer tapped against the mahogany bench. Instead, her fingers lay motionless, curled slightly as though gripping an invisible thread of restraint. But restraint is not infinite. Her voice, when it broke the silence, was sharp enough to cut glass. This isn't Congress, Congresswoman. Respect the court's decorum. The words cracked through the room like a gavel slammed in anger. Heads turned, a few gasps escaped the gallery, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not flinch. Her chin remained high, her hands steady on the podium. Respect doesn't mean silence, Your Honor, she said, her tone even, unshaken. For a split second, no one seemed to know what would happen next. The tension was a living thing, curling between marble columns and ricocheting off stained glass windows. Reporters scribbled furiously, their fingers flying across keyboards. One whispered without looking up, hashtag this now, hashtag AOCV Sotomayor. It's going to explode. In the corner, a court stenographer, known for her perfect detachment, stopped mid-keystroke. 10 years in that chair, she had never once looked up. Today she did. Her eyes fixed on the two women standing as symbols of two Americas. Chief Justice Roberts shifted slightly, his hand twitching near the microphone as if to intervene, but something held him back. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was recognition that the courtroom had just transformed from a stage of legal arguments into a crucible of generational reckoning. AOC inhaled deeply. Her next words carried an undertone that felt like both defiance and plea. With respect, Your Honors, this chamber is not above the people. It exists because of them. Justice Alito leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Justice Barrett glanced sideways at the Sotomayor, her pen frozen mid-sentence. Even Justice Thomas, known for his silence, lifted his eyes briefly. AOC didn't wait for permission to continue. If the people's voices are too messy, too emotional for this space, then perhaps it's time we ask whose justice this really is. The gallery was still, as if some invisible weight had pressed down on every shoulder at once. Phones vibrated silently in reporters' laps, notifications pinging with early headlines already flooding social media. The hashtag was climbing, fast. Hashtag AOCVs Sotomayor blinked on screens across America. Outside the court, crowds who had gathered with little expectation of drama began murmuring as updates trickled through live streams. The young congresswoman didn't falter. Her voice was calm, but her eyes blazed. Rosa Santiago didn't wait 6 hours in line for us to debate decorum. She waited because she believed her voice mattered. And yet here we are, debating whether her story belongs in this room. Sotomayor's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but then closed again. For the first time that morning, she blinked, not once, but twice. It was imperceptible, but in a room trained to notice nuance, it was seismic. One of the junior clerks shifted uncomfortably. Another whispered, "Did she just—" The words trailed off. The court's usual rhythm was gone, replaced by a strange electric stillness. AOC placed her palm flat on the folder in front of her. "This isn't defiance," she said quietly. "It's a reminder that this court's legacy isn't carved in marble. It's written every day in the lives of the people it serves." Justice Sotomayor leaned forward ever so slightly. Her dark eyes locked on the younger woman like a hawk sizing up an opponent, or perhaps an equal. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice now softer but no less cutting, "your passion is noted. But this court does not answer to passion. It answers to the Constitution." AOC's reply came without hesitation. "Then let's ensure the Constitution still answers to the people." In the press box, a seasoned reporter closed his notebook and murmured, "This isn't just a hearing anymore. It's a collision." His colleague beside him nodded, her fingers still flying across her keyboard. On the street outside, a crowd gathered around a single smartphone screen streaming the proceedings. An elderly man muttered, "She's pushing too hard." But the young woman next to him shook her head. "No, she's saying what nobody else dared to." Inside the chamber, the stare between Sotomayor and AOC held for what felt like an eternity. Neither blinked. Neither spoke. It was the silence of two storms meeting at the same point, their winds colliding violently but invisibly. Somewhere in that clash, the marble seemed almost to vibrate. The stenographer finally resumed typing, but her hands shook slightly as they moved. For the first time in her career, she wondered if history was writing itself faster than her keys could capture it. As cameras continued to click, as tweets flew, as hearts raced both inside and far beyond the courtroom, the world seemed to lean forward in its chair. Whatever this was, legal battle, moral reckoning, generational clash, it had only just begun. And in the stillness, just before Chief Justice Roberts cleared his throat to regain order, two pairs of eyes remained locked across the vast expanse of marble in history. The tension that had settled over the chamber in the previous exchange didn't dissipate. It deepened, curling tighter around every bench, every breath. The marble seemed colder now, as if the centuries carved into it could sense what was coming. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez placed her fingers lightly on the edge of the podium, her posture unshaken. When she spoke, her voice carried a crispness that cut clean through the heavy air. "We're not here to theorize about democracy, Your Honors. We're here because of what's at stake, millions of voters whose voices risk being buried." She paused just long enough for her words to settle before continuing. "Brown v. Board of Education reminded us that separate is never equal. Shelby County versus Holder reminded us, tragically, how fragile voting rights remain. Henderson versus Texas now asks whether we've learned anything at all." In the gallery, someone shifted noisily. A cough, the sound of a pen snapping in a reporter's nervous grip. AOC's gaze never wavered as she laid out her argument with the precision of a seasoned advocate, though she wasn't one in the traditional sense. She had the law's language, yes, but also the cadence of someone who'd spent years fighting for people who never made it into rooms like this. "Voting, Wes," she continued, her tone sharpening, "is not a privilege handed down from power. It's a promise enshrined in this nation's core. When that promise is broken, democracy itself is broken." Justice Sotomayor shifted in her high-backed chair, her robe whispering against polished wood. Then her voice came, cool and firm. "Are you here as a lawyer or as a politician, Congresswoman?" The question cut through the chamber, and for a moment all movement seemed to stop. Pens hovered midair. Reporters leaned forward as though proximity might catch the weight of AOC's answer. Even Justice Thomas glanced up from his notes. Alexandria didn't flinch. "I am here as a citizen's voice," she said evenly. "Isn't that what the Constitution protects?" The simplicity of her answer only heightened the weight behind it. Around the chamber, there was a subtle shift. Some of the spectators nodded slightly. Others frowned, arms crossing tightly across their chests. It was as though the room itself had divided, one side bristling at her audacity, the other caught off guard by how direct, how unapologetically human her stance was. Justice Gorsuch's brow furrowed. Justice Kavanaugh tapped his pen against his notes, though he didn't speak. Sotomayor's eyes narrowed slightly, her hands folding tighter as she leaned forward. But AOC pressed on, unyielding. When voting rights are treated as a gift, we strip them of their true meaning. They are not privileges. They are promises. Promises made to every person who dares to believe their voice matters. The words didn't just hang in the air. They seemed to pulse. A ripple of unease, or perhaps recognition, moved through the gallery. A law professor whispered to her colleague, "She's not arguing law, she's arguing legacy." A student nearby nodded silently, eyes fixed on AOC, as if seeing her not as a politician, but as something else entirely. Sotomayor's gaze bore into her like a blade. Her voice, when it came again, was measured yet edged. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, the Constitution is upheld not by sentiment, but by structure. Are you suggesting we abandon precedent for passion?" Alexandria's expression didn't falter. "No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting precedent means nothing if it protects systems that silence millions." The reply wasn't louder than her previous statements, but it felt heavier, drawing a low murmur from the gallery. On the street outside, crowds were growing larger as word of the confrontation spread. Screens lit up with live updates. The hashtag AOCVC's Sotomayor surged, trending across platforms. Inside, the stenographer's fingers danced over the keyboard at a pace that betrayed the urgency of the moment. She couldn't miss a syllable. Not today. AOC shifted her weight slightly but stayed steady, her hands clasped now. This court doesn't just interpret laws. It defines who we are as a nation. And right now, people are asking, do their voices still matter here? Her eyes moved deliberately to meet those of every justice seated before her, pausing at Sotomayor last. There was no immediate reply, just the faint scrape of a chair somewhere in the gallery and the hushed sound of a reporter whispering, "This is no longer a hearing, it's a standoff." The wire of silence snapped, not with shouting, not with gavel strikes, but with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's voice, low and steady as she began. "When I was 8, I stood in line with my mother outside a voting center in the Bronx. The line snaked around 3 city blocks. She held my hand tight, her fingers cold despite the heat of the afternoon. Every step forward felt like a victory until we reached the door. A brief pause, the kind that pulls listeners closer. They told her her registration was invalid. A clerical error, they said. She'd lived in that apartment for 15 years, paid taxes, raised 2 children. But to them, her district no longer existed." The gallery was still. Even the rustling of reporters' papers stopped. AOC's eyes glistened, but her voice didn't waver. "That night, I watched my mother cry at our kitchen table. She cried over a ballot she was never allowed to cast. And to an 8-year-old, the Constitution felt very far away." Sotomayor shifted slightly, her robe catching faint light. Her fingers curled tighter around her pen until it splintered with a soft crack. The sound echoed in the chamber like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A clerk darted forward to replace the broken pen, but Sotomayor waved her off, her jaw clenched. The crack wasn't just in the pen. It felt as if it had appeared in the room's carefully polished calm. Justice Alito cleared his throat sharply, cutting into the thick silence. "Congresswoman, let's stay on legal grounds. The court is not a forum for emotional testimony." His words were firm, but not unkind, an attempt to steer the exchange back into familiar territory. AOC turned her gaze to him, her voice neither raised nor sharpened, but all the more piercing for its restraint. "Legal grounds are human grounds, Your Honor. Laws mean nothing if they ignore the lives they govern." Somewhere in the back, a law student whispered to a friend, "She's threading a needle, tying doctrine to flesh and blood." The friend said nothing, eyes locked on the woman at the podium. Justice Kavanaugh shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the armrest in an irregular rhythm. Justice Barrett's pen hovered over her notepad, unmoving, as if caught between recording the moment and simply watching it unfold. Even Chief Justice Roberts leaned slightly forward, though his face remained carefully impassive. AOC's voice grew softer, pulling the room with her. This isn't just about one woman in the Bronx. It's about every grandmother who waited in line believing her voice mattered. Every veteran who came home to find his voting rights quietly erased. Every student told their polling station was moved. Again. She exhaled slowly, her next words landing with the weight of inevitability. The Constitution isn't marble and ink. It's the people who cry at kitchen tables because they've been silenced. In the gallery, a young woman in a business suit dabbed at her eyes. A man in a worn denim jacket crossed his arms tighter over his chest but didn't look away. The court stenographer hesitated for just a fraction of a second before resuming her steady typing. Even she could feel it, the shift. Sotomayor took in a deep breath through her nose, releasing it slowly. The sound was audible, deliberate. Her eyes narrowed, her voice tight. You're compelling, Congresswomen, but law isn't about stories, it's about principles. AOC met her gaze head on. Stories are principles in motion, Your Honor. They show us not what law says, but what law does. A ripple passed through the spectators, some nodding, others stiffening. Reporters' pens scratched faster now, eager to capture every word before the next tremor in the room. The hashtag, the weight of stories began trending within seconds as clips leaked from live tweets outside. Justice Gorsuch spoke for the first time, his voice calm but curious. Are you arguing for a jurisprudence rooted in human narrative? AOC didn't blink. I'm arguing for a jurisprudence that remembers why it exists at all. The silence after AOC's last words was not passive. It carried weight, a charged stillness as though the entire chamber had collectively forgotten how to exhale. Reporters exchanged glances, their pens poised midair, aware they were no longer documenting just another oral argument, but something alive, something about to crack open. One typed furiously into his phone. AOC's delivery? A masterclass in lived constitutionalism. The phrase caught fire, bouncing across Twitter as if it had been waiting for this moment. Up on the bench, Justice Sotomayor's expression hardened, her jaw tight. Personal anecdotes, she said sharply, her tone slicing through the tension, are irrelevant here. This court's duty is to law, not to emotional appeals. The words rang out, deliberate and final, or so they seemed intended. But Alexandra did not step back. She didn't avert her eyes or temper her voice. With respect, Your Honor, she began, her cadence unflinching. Wasn't your life story part of your confirmation? Did it not shape your interpretation of justice? Or should we pretend the sacrifices of your mother and your own struggles were footnotes, not foundations? The gallery stirred audibly, the sound of bodies shifting in seats, whispers too loud to be contained. A young journalist muttered under her breath, She's turning Sotomayor's legacy into her weapon. Sotomayor's fingers flexed around a fresh pen, the fractured one from earlier still lying unnoticed at her side. There was a flicker in her eyes. Anger, yes, but perhaps also recognition. Recognition of a tactic she herself might have used in another lifetime. Her reply came quick, sharper now. Congresswoman, I will not permit this chamber to become a stage for theatrics. AOC's expression was calm, almost disarming in its steadiness. Justice isn't theater, she said softly, but for too many outside these walls, it feels like a show where they're never in the audience, let alone on the stage. The remark wasn't shouted, yet it echoed louder than if she had raised her voice. Flashbulbs went off from the press section, each burst of light punctuating the stillness. Justice Kavanaugh leaned forward, perhaps to interject, but stopped when he saw Sotomayor's hand rise slightly, not a gesture of dismissal, but of pause. She stared down at AOC, and in that long moment, the room seemed to shrink, pulling every eye, every breath into the narrow space between two women separated by decades in doctrine. The hashtag AOC Vivsem Sotomayor trended worldwide in less than 5 minutes. Social media flooded with clips and comments, some praising AOC's audacity, others condemning her for breaching decorum. Inside the chamber, however, there was no debate, only a suffocating awareness that precedent was being tested. not just in the legal sense, but in the human sense. Alexandria's hands tightened on the podium, knuckles whitening, though her voice remained steady. I am not here to perform, Your Honor. I'm here because every time voting rights are eroded, communities like mine are erased. This isn't politics. It's democracy. She turned slightly, her eyes catching the lenses of dozens of cameras trained on her all. Flash after flash lit her face like lightning striking marble. In the press section, a veteran reporter murmured, "She knows exactly what she's doing." Another answered without looking up, "So does Sotomayor, and she doesn't like it." For a heartbeat, the courtroom felt like a powder keg seconds from ignition. And still, neither woman blinked. The sharp click of a pen being set down broke the silence first. Justice Sotomayor's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, the weight of her decades on the bench pressing into every syllable that followed. Do you believe law should bend to emotions, Congresswoman? The question wasn't loud, but it carried the force of a gavel, reverberating through the chamber with an authority that demanded an answer. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady on the podium, her gaze unwavering as she met the justice's stare. Law without humanity isn't law, she said, her tone low but sharp enough to draw an audible intake of breath from the gallery. It's oppression with a robe. For a moment, there was no sound at all, not even the rhythmic tapping of Sotomayor's pen that had punctuated earlier exchanges. Instead, a new sound took its place. The crisp turning of pages as clerks and justices alike shifted through notes, their movements deliberate, almost offensive. The tension that hung over the room thickened, as though the air itself had weight. A law student seated near the back leaned to whisper, his voice barely audible. I've never seen a justice push this far. His friend didn't reply. Her eyes were fixed on AOC, her hand unconsciously clutching the edge of her notebook. AOC shifted slightly, her voice gaining a subtle edge as she addressed the bench. This case isn't about lines on a map. It's about voices erased, communities carved out of representation as if they were nothing more than statistics to be rearranged. She paused, letting the words settle, her eyes scanning the faces before her. This court has the power to decide whether those voices are heard or silenced. Sotomayor's fingers curled around the armrest of her chair. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the faintest tremor in her hand betraying an internal struggle, invisible to most but unmistakable to those who knew her. In the press section, a seasoned reporter whispered to his colleague, "This isn't just a hearing anymore. It's a duel." The colleague nodded, eyes never leaving the podium. Justice Gorsuch shifted in his seat, his voice breaking the silence. "Congresswoman, are you suggesting we abandon precedent entirely for perceived fairness?" The question hung in the air, heavy and pointed. AOC's response was calm, her words deliberate. I'm suggesting that precedent built on injustice isn't stability, it's stagnation. Laws that ignore lived realities are nothing more than abstractions, safe for courts, but lethal for the people they govern. The murmurs from the gallery grew louder, quickly hushed by a clerk's sharp glance. The hashtag voices erased was already climbing online, tweets flying as viewers outside the courtroom latched onto every word, every shift of tone. Inside, the air felt electric, charged with the knowledge that something rare was unfolding. AOC's eyes moved across the bench again, pausing briefly on Sotomayor. Your Honor, she continued, her voice softening but not losing its edge. You know better than most what it means to carry stories of those who came before, to bring them into spaces where they were never meant to be heard. I ask only that we extend that same courtesy to the people this decision will affect. There was a subtle stillness in Sotomayor's posture now, her shoulders rigid but her expression less certain than it had been minutes earlier. She exhaled slowly, a sound that felt louder than it was, drawing every eye back to her. The chamber waited, hanging on the brink between confrontation and capitulation, as if the very walls could sense the fault lines shifting beneath centuries of tradition. The weight of the silence fractured when Justice Sotomayor's voice rose, sharper than it had been all morning. This chamber isn't for political theater, Congresswoman. Her words sliced clean through the hushed courtroom, drawing a collective inhale from the gallery. Reporters shifted forward instinctively, pens poised, their eyes darting between the bench and the podium. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's posture didn't falter. She let the justice's words settle like dust before answering, her voice calm yet carrying an undertone that demanded attention. Justice isn't theater, it's real life for the people we serve. The faint sound of a camera shutter punctuated the air as all eyes remained locked on the two women. The tension didn't just hang, it coiled, dense and palpable. AOC's gaze swept the room, her tone softening slightly, but losing none of its impact. Last year I met a veteran in my district, a black man who had served 2 tours overseas. When he returned home, ready to vote for the first time in years, he was told his polling station had been consolidated, moved miles away without notice. He never got to cast his ballot. A murmur rippled through the chamber, a subtle shifting of bodies and papers. Even Justice Gorsuch, whose pen had been scratching steadily since the hearing began, froze mid-word. The stillness that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of a law clerk shifting uncomfortably in her chair. AOC's voice dropped lower, drawing the room in. For him, justice isn't abstract. It's the right to be seen, to be heard, to matter. She let the words hang for a heartbeat longer, her eyes finding Sotomayor's again. The justice's jaw tightened, her fingers drumming once against the bench before falling still. For a woman known for her composure, the flush rising in her cheeks was unmistakable. "You're passionate, Congresswoman," Sotomayor said, her tone measured but laced with steel. "But passion does not rewrite law." Alexandria didn't blink, and law that ignores passion, that ignores people, isn't worthy of the Constitution it claims to defend. A gasp escaped someone in the gallery. A reporter's fingers flew across a keyboard, the words already forming headlines that would ripple far beyond these marble walls. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as 2 generations of power locked eyes, one a symbol of institutional resilience, the other a relentless challenger standing unshaken in the line of fire. The air in the Supreme Court felt like glass, fragile, ready to shatter with the slightest sound. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's hands rested firmly on the podium as she drew in a steady breath. Her voice, when it came, was neither loud nor rushed, yet it carried with it a force that made pens freeze midair and eyes lock on her. The Constitution doesn't belong to the privileged few who interpret it. It belongs to every hand that holds a ballot. The words rolled through the chamber like a wave, subtle at first, but gathering power as it hit each corner of the room. For the first time in the hearing, Justice Sotomayor said nothing. No clipped retort, no raised brow. She simply sat still, her lips pressed tight, her fingers motionless on the bench. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that swallows even the faint hum of air conditioning. The shuffle of papers, the nervous coughs. It was as if every person in the room was holding their breath, unwilling to break whatever spell had settled over them. In the back row, a young woman in a navy suit whispered to the colleague beside her, "Did she just silence Sotomayor?" The colleague didn't answer, too busy watching as history seemed to crystallize in real time. Outside the chamber, phones vibrated relentlessly. Twitter feeds flooded with clips, sound bites, and reactions. The hashtag Constitution for All flashed on screens, climbing into trending lists within minutes. AOC's words had leapt beyond the marble walls before the echoes inside had even faded. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was tentative at first, almost questioning its own existence. But before it could gather a momentum, a security officer snapped his head toward the source. "Sir, no applause in the chamber," he said firmly. The clapping stopped as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind an even heavier silence than before. AOC didn't turn toward the interruption. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, her expression calm yet unyielding. It wasn't victory she wore on her face, nor defiance. It was something quieter, heavier, determination tempered by the knowledge of how much was still at stake. Justice Gorsuch set down his pen, his note-taking abandoned. Across the bench, Justice Barrett's hands rested still on her lap, her gaze unreadable. Even Chief Justice Roberts leaned slightly forward, the faintest crease in his brow betraying a flicker of unease. As cameras continued to click softly in the press section, A veteran court reporter whispered, "This isn't just going to be a headline. It's going to be a reckoning." His colleague's fingers danced across a phone screen, already typing. AOC's words sparked national uproar as #Constitution for all trends globally. The room seemed suspended in time. All movement slowed, all sound muted. And then the camera lenses almost instinctively began to zoom in on Justice Sotomayor. Her face was a study in composure, but in her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, there it was. A flicker. Doubt. The chamber didn't relax after the last exchange. If anything, the stillness had grown heavier, denser, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped back to adjust the microphone. Her tone had shifted, lower now, deliberate, as though the weight of what she carried required more than volume to land. "I want to tell you about the Jimenez family," she began, her voice threading through the air like smoke. "Legal immigrants, taxpayers, parents of 2 children born in this country. For years they voted in every local and federal election, believing in a system they thought saw them." She let the pause linger just enough for her words to reach every corner of the vast chamber. Then came redistricting. Their precinct disappeared overnight. They showed up at their usual polling place, IDs in hand, children in tow, and they were told, "You don't belong to this district anymore." Sotomayor leaned forward slightly. Her expression remained sharp, her gaze steady, but there was a subtle tightness around her mouth. To most, she still looked every bit the commanding jurist. But those closest to her might have caught something beneath the surface. A flicker, not of anger but of hesitation. "This isn't theory, this is reality. This is their America," AOC said, her voice rising not in pitch but in resonance, each repetition landing harder than the last. A reporter in the press section coughed softly, the sound startlingly loud in the charged quiet. Heads turned for a split second before snapping back, no one daring to let their attention stray for long. AOC's fingers tightened on the edges of the podium. "Every ruling this court makes either builds the bridge for those voices to cross or pulls the planks out from under their feet. So I ask you, what kind of America are we shaping here?" Her words didn't come like a demand. They came like a verdict already forming in the minds of those listening. Sotomayor's eyes narrowed further, but her fingers betrayed her as they flexed once on the bench, an unconscious gesture. It wasn't lost on the gallery. Even Justice Barrett's brow furrowed slightly, her pen paused mid-note. "This isn't theory. This is reality. This is their America," AOC repeated, softer now, yet somehow heavier, each word carrying the echoes of voices outside the marble walls. The gallery held its collective breath as she closed her statement. If their America doesn't count, then none of ours does. The chamber felt tighter with every breath, as if the very walls had drawn closer. Justice Sotomayor's voice rose, sharp and unrelenting, her questions falling like a hammer striking iron. "Do you propose we let emotions rewrite the law, Congresswoman? Do you suggest dismantling precedent because it no longer fits the narrative you prefer?" Each word was deliberate, acerbo, heavy, echoing against the marble like warning bells. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood firm, her hands gripping the edges of the podium as though anchoring herself against the storm. "Precedent built on injustice is a house of cards," she replied evenly, her tone neither defensive nor aggressive, but resolute in a way that made several in the gallery straighten unconsciously. The air thickened. Even the faint whir of the air conditioning seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of a reporter's pen tapping rhythmically against a notepad. It was not an intentional beat, but an anxious one, filling the oppressive silence that followed AOC's words. Somewhere behind the press section, a quiet sob broke the stillness. A middle-aged man in the gallery wiped at his face, his shoulders shaking faintly. His whisper, though soft, carried across the charged quiet. "My brother died in uniform believing his vote mattered." No one turned to look. No one dared. Sotomayor's fingers curled tighter on the edge of her bench as she leaned slightly forward. The crispness of her robe shifted against wood, the sound startling in the silence. "You speak of injustice as though this court hasn't fought for it," she said, her voice quieter now but laced with steel. "What are you really asking of this court, Congresswoman?" Alexandria met her gaze without hesitation. "I'm asking this court to remember why it exists at all," she said. Her voice didn't rise, but the words seemed to press into the room with a force that left no air to spare. The stillness in the courtroom seemed to vibrate, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's voice broke through with a calm intensity that drew every pair of eyes back to her. "I'm asking you to see them, to hear them, to remember the Constitution isn't marble and ink, it's people." The words landed with the weight of something undeniable. She let the pause hang, then repeated, softer but sharper with each echo. "People, people, people." Each repetition struck a different corner of the chamber, pulling at the unseen threads between bench and gallery, between power and the lives it governs. Justice Sotomayor's grip on her pen tightened, the faint creak of plastic audible even in the charged quiet. Her eyes, once flint-like, softened just enough to betray the inner tension she fought to keep hidden. Her voice, when it came, was steady but lower, tinged with something unspoken. "And if we don't?" It wasn't quite a challenge, nor a concession. It was a question that carried the weight of centuries. Alexandria didn't hesitate. "Then history will." The simplicity of her response was devastating. No flourish, no rise in tone, just a steady truth that seemed to ripple outward like a stone dropped in still water. A subtle shiver ran through the gallery. A reporter's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering softly against the floor, but no one moved to retrieve it. Across the bench, Justice Barrett's hand froze mid-note. Even Justice Gorsuch, usually unflappable, looked momentarily still, his pen held inches above his notepad. The room fell into a silence so thick it seemed alive. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the quiet tapping of laptop keys from the press section. It was as if time had been suspended, the collective breath of everyone present trapped in their chests. And in that suspended moment, the air between AOC and Sotomayor became electric. One charged with the weight of challenge, reflection, and the faintest trace of understanding. The shift in the room was almost imperceptible at first. The air no longer crackled with defiance, but hummed with something quieter, heavier. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's voice lowered, not out of hesitation, but out of a deliberate choice to draw people closer. "When I was a child," she began, her eyes drifting slightly, as though pulling the memory from a place long buried, "I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of fabric snapping under the weight of my mother's hands. She'd sit at our kitchen table in the Bronx, under a flickering light, folding and pressing uniforms for a dry cleaner. Her fingers were raw from work, her shoulders slumped from exhaustion, but she never let me see her cry. Not then." The words settled like dust across the marble chamber. Reporters slowed their typing. Even Justice Barrett glanced up from her notes. AOC's hands, resting lightly on the podium, flexed as though bracing against the memory. "She wanted to make sure I went to school with clean clothes. She wanted me to believe this country could be better, that it could see us." Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. The quiet ache in her voice did what no volume could. Justice Sotomayor's gaze had been steady until now. For the first time, her eyes dropped to the bench. Her fingers, which had gripped her pen so firmly through the earlier exchanges, loosened. The pen rolled lazily across the wood before coming to rest near her papers. Alexandria drew in a slow breath, her words soft but unrelenting. "Justice isn't abstract to my mother. It's not theory, not doctrine, not words hidden in footnotes. It's whether her daughter's vote counts, whether her labor meant something to a country she still prays for every night." A hush rippled through the room like a breeze moving unseen. In the gallery, a young woman clutched her notepad to her chest. Her lips parted as though to say something, but no sound came. Beside her, a man with gray at his temples leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's not arguing. She's pleading for all of us." The room seemed to constrict, the ornate walls pressing inward as AOC continued. "I remember her saving coins in a cracked jar labeled Voting Day. She wanted to make sure she had enough for bus fare and a sandwich to keep her energy while she stood in line for hours. That jar sat in our kitchen for months. And on that day, she dressed carefully, held my hand, and we went to the polls." Her voice faltered slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of the memory. We waited 3 hours, 4, 6, only to be told her district had been changed, that she was at the wrong location, that her vote didn't matter here. The faint sound of a reporter's pen hitting the floor echoed unnaturally loud in the chamber. No one moved to pick it up. AOC's gaze swept the room, her eyes glinting with something sharper than tears. Do you know what it does to a child to watch her mother, a woman who crossed oceans and bore every insult with dignity, sit silently at a kitchen table, staring at her hands because her voice was stolen? Justice Sotomayor's fingers twitched, and though her face remained composed, there was a softness in her jawline that hadn't been there before. This is why I'm here, AOC said. Not for theatrics, not for headlines, for every mother like mine who believed in this country even when it refused to see her. The stillness deepened. A single cough from the press box drew irritated glances, the sound intrusive in a room where even breaths now seemed calculated. Alexandria didn't look away from the bench. If we're here to talk about justice, then we must talk about people, because without them, this institution is just marble and echoes. The weight of the moment pressed on every corner of the chamber as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's voice, calm yet cutting, filled the air. Justice Sotomayor, you once told Congress your mother's sacrifices made you who you are, that her nights of endless work and her unspoken resilience shaped not only your path, but your understanding of justice itself. Why then are the sacrifices of these people, of mothers like mine, less worthy here? The question didn't come like a weapon. It came like a reflection held steady in the air for all to see, especially the woman sitting high above her in the robe of authority. Justice Sotomayor's posture didn't change, but her fingers brushed lightly over the edge of her bench as though grounding herself. The words landed with a kind of resonance that even marble seemed unable to absorb. From the far end of the bench, Justice Gorsuch exhaled, a sound so soft it would have been missed if not for the stillness suffocating the room. It wasn't annoyance. There was no sharpness in it, no edge of poignancy. Instead, it carried an undertone of something rarer within these walls. Reluctant recognition. A few in the gallery turned slightly, eyes flicking toward him, surprised to hear any sound at all from the conservative justice known for his meticulous composure. In the press section, pens scraped across paper at an uneven pace as journalists fought to keep up. One leaned closer to her colleague, her voice a whisper that trembled with the weight of what she was witnessing. She's turned Sotomayor's legacy into a mirror, and the court is looking. Her colleague didn't respond, too busy typing furiously, the glow of his laptop screen reflected in wide, unblinking eyes. Sotomayor's lips parted slightly, her eyes locked not on AOC, but on some point beyond the chamber, as if searching memory for an anchor. Her voice, when it came, was softer than anyone expected, almost as if speaking to herself. Perhaps I forgot how much the law must listen. It wasn't a concession, it wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to a crack in her granite resolve that anyone in the room had ever seen. The silence that followed felt alive. It wasn't absence, it was presence. A thick, humming awareness that shifted over the room like a shadow. The faint hum of the air conditioning sounded suddenly louder, mechanical and awkward against the human stillness it tried to fill. In the gallery, a young law student pressed her hands together in her lap, knuckles white. She mouthed words she didn't dare say aloud. This is history. Alexandra didn't move, her hands still resting lightly on the podium, her shoulders straight. She didn't press her advantage. There was no need. The words had already been set loose, and like ripples on water, they were reaching places she could not touch with force alone. Her silence was as pointed as her question had been, allowing the weight of the exchange to linger, to settle in the minds of those watching, inside and far beyond these walls. Justice Barrett's eyes flickered toward Sotomayor briefly, but she said nothing. Even Chief Justice Roberts shifted in his seat, his fingertips tapping against the wood in a rhythm so faint it could have been mistaken for nerves. No one dared to break the fragile balance now suspended over the room. The light streaming through the high stained glass windows caught the gold threads of Sotomayor's robe, and for the briefest moment, it seemed to illuminate her expression. Not hardened, not soft, but caught in a quiet reckoning. And still, no one spoke. The chamber had become a place where every sound felt intrusive, where even the sound of a single breath carried the weight of a verdict. The air in the Supreme Court felt almost thick enough to touch, each breath in the gallery slow and measured, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's voice took on a tone that was no longer combative but almost tender. Yet it carried a resonance that settled over every corner of the chamber. If law becomes so sterile it cannot hear, it ceases to serve. The words didn't rise above a conversational volume, but they seemed to reverberate like a drumbeat in the silence, striking chords too deep to ignore. In the rows of law students seated along the gallery, a young woman brushed at her cheek, a streak of tears smudging her eyeliner. A man beside her leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his whispered words almost too faint to catch. "This is why we came to law school." The sentence was both confession and conviction, echoing faintly as though the room itself had heard and understood. Justice Sotomayor's fingers, resting lightly on the polished wood, stilled. Slowly her head lifted, and for the first time that morning, her eyes held not the sharp edge of a cross-examiner, but a subdued light, one born of reflection. "Your words weigh heavy, Congresswoman," she said softly, her tone stripped of the earlier steel. There was no challenge this time, no defense, only a quiet acknowledgement that the chamber felt profoundly different now. Alexandria didn't break eye contact. Her response came without hesitation, her voice even and steady, yet laced with something larger than herself. "They're not my words. They're America's." She let the silence that followed breathe fully, as though daring anyone to fill it too quickly. The stained glass windows towering over the bench caught a shaft of sunlight, casting fragments of color across the chamber's floor. Slowly, the shifting glow moved, landing squarely on the stack of papers in front of AOC. The light touched her hands, the edges of her notes, and for a heartbeat it seemed as though the room had conspired to frame her in gold. A court reporter, long accustomed to suppressing emotion in this space, paused her typing just long enough to murmur under her breath, "A handoff." Even Justice Gorsuch, silent for most of the proceedings, let his pen rest flat against his notes. His brow furrowed, not in disagreement, but as if working through a realization too large to name. In the back row, another law student wiped his eyes quickly, glancing around as though embarrassed by his own reaction. Reporters typed furiously now, headlines forming in real time, their screens glowing with fragments of history in the making. A veteran journalist muttered, almost to himself, "This isn't just a case anymore. This is a crossroads." And yet, in that marble room where history so often felt cold and untouchable, something warm had shifted. The light continued to spill over AOC's desk, unbothered by time or tension, casting its glow like a quiet proclamation. The quiet that had settled over the Supreme Court now felt different, not the fragile silence of hesitation, but the charged stillness of a room holding its collective breath. Justice Sotomayor's voice broke through, calm but edged with something sharper, her eyes fixed intently on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. "Are you asking this court to legislate from the bench, Congresswoman?" The words landed like a gavel, their deliberate precision aimed to corner, to demand clarity in front of a nation watching. AOC didn't blink. She straightened slightly, her fingers resting steady on the podium, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "No, Your Honor," she said, her tone measured, yet carrying an undercurrent of quiet defiance. "I'm asking it to lead from humanity." A ripple passed through the gallery, a collective shifting of bodies, the soft rustle of fabric and papers. The tension wound tighter, a thread pulled taut. Even breath seemed heavier now, audible in the stillness that followed. A reporter near the front scribbled furiously, her pen scratching across the page with the urgency of someone recording not just testimony, but history. At the far end of the bench, Justice Thomas remained still, his eyes hooded, while Justice Gorsuch, typically stoic, tilted his head slightly. For the first time, there was the faintest movement, a subtle nod, and almost imperceptible, but enough to draw a sharp intake of breath from a law student seated directly behind the press section. "Did he just?" she whispered, cutting herself off as her friend clutched her arm in disbelief. The sound of the air conditioning filled the void for a moment, mechanical and cold against the heat rising in the chamber. AOC's eyes didn't waver as she continued, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 silent stories. This court has long claimed to be the guardian of liberty, but liberty without empathy becomes brittle. Leadership without humanity loses its way. I'm not asking you to change the law. I'm asking you to remember the people who live beneath it. Somewhere in the gallery, a soft murmur rippled. A middle-aged man in a neatly pressed suit leaned to the woman beside him, his whisper barely audible. She's not appealing to their logic anymore. She's appealing to their conscience. Justice Sotomayor's fingers tightened briefly on the armrest, her face unreadable. But her next words were softer, no longer carrying the sharp edges of earlier. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you ask a lot of this institution. Alexandria's eyes remained locked on hers, unflinching. No more than the people ask of their democracy every day. The phrase carried. It wasn't shouted, but it seemed to echo nonetheless, finding its way into the furthest corners of the chamber and beyond, spilling into the feeds and screens of millions watching. On social media, hashtags ignited like sparks. Hashtag Justice Listens climbed within minutes, followed closely by hashtag Humanity before precedent. The tension didn't break. It transformed. No one in the chamber spoke, not the justices, not the spectators, not even the reporters who had filled notebook after notebook. The only sound was the faint tap of a single finger against a wood railing, a nervous tick from a clerk struggling to keep her own composure. As Alexandria stood at the podium, framed by the shifting light from the stained glass windows, it wasn't power she projected. It was persistence, the kind forged in quiet kitchens and long lines outside polling stations, carried now into the heart of America's highest court. The chamber's silence stretched so long it began to feel alive, humming against the marble floors and high vaulted ceilings. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez reached slowly into the pocket of her blazer, her fingers brushing against the folded paper she'd carried like a talisman. As she pulled it out, the faint rustle of parchment echoed louder than any gavel strike. The gold light streaming through the stained glass windows caught on its edges, turning it into a sliver of fire in her hand. "This," she said softly, "is the oath I took on my first day in Congress." Her eyes swept the bench and then the gallery as she unfolded them, her voice steady but resonant enough to carry across the marble expanse. "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." Her fingers tightened slightly on the paper, and her next words came in a cadence that felt like both confession and incantation. "I swore for them. I swore for them. I swore for them." Each repetition grew heavier, sinking deeper into the hushed room until even the clerk seemed to stop breathing. Justice Sotomayor's gaze softened, her earlier sharpness giving way to something quieter, almost pained. "And you believe the court has failed them?" Her voice was not the booming authority of a justice at her most commanding. It was lower, almost vulnerable, as if she too felt the weight pressing in. Alexandria didn't hesitate, though her tone carried no triumph. "Not yet," she said, "but silence is a failure waiting to happen." Somewhere in the gallery a sob broke loose, a raw, unguarded sound. A woman in the second row covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders trembling as tears streamed down her face. The sound wasn't loud, but in a room so still it became a drumbeat of its own, a reminder of the human stakes that so often got lost in the abstractions of law. AOC didn't look away from the bench. Her eyes locked with Sotomayor's, and for a moment it wasn't a congresswoman and a Supreme Court justice staring at each other. It was two daughters of hardworking mothers, two women carrying generations of expectations on their backs, standing in a rare and dangerous space where power and conscience collided. In the press box, a veteran reporter dropped his pen, letting it roll noisily across the floor without retrieving it. His fingers hovered over his keyboard before he whispered to no one in particular, "This isn't an argument anymore. It's an awakening." The weight of her oath lingered in the air like a living thing, and as Alexandria lowered the paper back into her pocket, the light through the stained glass shifted slightly, casting her figure in hues of red and blue, colors of a flag that promised more than it often delivered. For a moment, the chamber seemed locked in place, the heavy stillness so absolute that even the ornate clock above the bench felt like it had stopped ticking. Justice Sotomayor sat unmoving, her fingers resting lightly on the bench's polished edge. Then, in a voice low but carrying the kind of gravity only decades on the bench could forge, she spoke. Perhaps justice is not marble. Perhaps it is clay, ever shaped by those it serves. The words were soft, almost fragile, yet they rippled through the air with the weight of something historic. Heads in the gallery turned sharply, pens halted mid-scratch, and even a few justices shifted in their seats as if startled by the openness of the remark. The silence that followed cracked suddenly when a lone person in the public gallery rose to their feet, clapping slowly but resolutely. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, a chorus of applause rising, echoing in the cavernous chamber in a way no one had ever dared before. The sound wasn't raucous, it was reverent, a quiet thunder born not of celebration, but of release, of recognition. It was an act so unprecedented that even the stenographer hesitated, hands frozen above her keys, unsure whether to record it at all. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped back from the podium, her eyes glistening but unbroken. She let the applause wash over her, not as a victory, but as a signal that the message had landed far beyond her own voice. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner. Justice isn't given, it's demanded. A reporter near the back lowered his camera for a brief second, whispering into his recorder, "This is the day marble softened." His words were barely audible, but in a space charged with history, even whispers felt magnified. As the clapping began to ebb, the gallery settled once more into silence, though not the same silence as before. This one was alive, vibrating with an energy that felt almost dangerous, as though change had been invited in and was now pacing the marble floors. Sotomayor's eyes followed AOC as she stepped away from the podium. The justice's expression was no longer unreadable. It was softened, tinged with something deeper, reflection perhaps, or an understanding born too late. The final light of afternoon streamed through the stained glass windows, catching the strands of AOC's hair, her blazer, her hands as they brushed lightly against the wooden railing. It was a glow not of triumph, but of transfer, a moment caught between what was and what could be. As she reached the chamber's exit, she didn't turn back. But Sotomayor's gaze lingered, her face calm, yet undeniably changed, her eyes following with a softness and depth that said more than words ever could. The morning after, America woke to headlines screaming across every platform. CNN called it a defining moment for the Supreme Court. The New York Times ran a banner that read, "AOC sparks historic shift in judicial discourse." Even Fox News, often critical, labeled it the day the court was challenged like never before. In under 24 hours, hashtag AOC Sotomayor surged past 30 million mentions on social media, a digital wildfire that crossed state lines and political divides. TikTok clips of her calm but piercing words, "Justice isn't given, it's demanded," were lip-synced by college students and retirees alike. Threads filled with debates raged between constitutional purists and reform advocates. At Harvard, a renowned constitutional law professor tweeted to his hundreds of thousands of followers, "AOC reminded the court it exists because of the people, not despite them. This will be studied for decades." That tweet alone sparked its own sub-thread of reactions, from praise to fiery disagreement. Meanwhile, students at Georgetown huddled in lecture halls, replaying footage of the hearing, their notebooks covered in frantic annotations. One first-year whispered to her classmate as she scribbled, "This wasn't just law, it was alive." Days later, Justice Sotomayor addressed a packed auditorium at a judicial conference in Chicago. Cameras crowded the back walls as her opening remarks echoed with quiet candor. "Humility is a strength of the law," she said. The audience froze, hanging on every word. "We are tasked to interpret, not to insulate. And sometimes the strongest interpretation begins with listening." A ripple of murmurs spread as reporters furiously typed notes, aware that even this subtle acknowledgement marked a shift. In law schools across the nation, professors updated syllabi to include the Crockett-Sotomayor exchange as a case study in judicial dialogue. Mock trial teams quoted lines from the hearing as rallying cries. A student at NYU posted a photo of her notes on Instagram with the caption, "This is why we chose this path, to remind power that it serves people." But outside academia, the ripple spread further. Civic groups began organizing town halls under banners reading, "Justice is listening." Thousands shared their own stories of voter suppression, systemic inequities, and the small acts of resistance they believed mattered. The hearing had unlocked something, though no one yet dared to predict what it would become. And in a quiet office somewhere in Washington, a staffer watched the viral clips play on repeat. Her eyes narrowed, not in disagreement but in calculation, as she whispered to herself, "This isn't over, not by a long shot." The screen's glow reflected in her eyes as though the question she carried had already begun to take root. What happens when marble bends, but doesn't break? 3 weeks later, the marble halls of a Washington conference center hummed with anticipation as legal scholars, judges, and legislators gathered for the annual Judicial Policy Summit. Cameras flashed in the lobby, journalists murmuring about one moment no one had expected to see again so soon. In a quiet side room away from the main stage, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Justice Sonia Sotomayor stood face to face for the first time since the hearing. The air between them was not charged with tension now, but with something subtler. Respect forged in the fire of public discourse. Sotomayor's eyes softened as she broke the silence. "You challenge me, Congresswoman," she said, her voice low but steady. "That's what democracy needs." AOC's lips curved into a small smile that didn't seek victory, only recognition. "And you listen, Justice? That's what justice needs." The room seemed to contract as photographers caught the moment their hands met in a firm, deliberate handshake. The sound of shutters clicking echoed like distant applause, and within minutes the image flooded social media feeds. On Twitter, it was shared by senators, activists, and even late-night hosts. A caption from a law student went viral. "This is what co-equal branches of government look like." Outside the conference hall, protesters and supporters alike gathered, their signs ranging from "Justice must bend" to "Balance restored." Inside, the atmosphere shifted as attendees, from rookie clerks to seasoned judges, whispered about the symbolism of the handshake. "Did you see it?" one asked, as if unsure they'd actually witnessed it. "That was history," another replied, eyes still locked on the photo lighting up their phone screen. The conversation between the two women continued, quiet enough that only the closest aides could hear. There was no grandstanding here, no need for sound bites, just two voices weaving together across the divide of roles and generations. When Sotomayor finally said, "The court must never fear the people it serves," AOC answered without hesitation, "And the people must never forget the power of their voice." In that small room, time seemed to slow, not because of any single sentence, but because the world outside had begun to imagine what might be possible if such conversations didn't end in applause, but in action. As they released their hands, the flash of a camera caught Sotomayor's expression, not guarded this time, but almost serene. And for a moment, as aides opened the doors to lead them back into the hall, it felt like the air carried a question no one dared to voice. What happens when two forces of power stop colliding and start converging? The auditorium was packed to the rafters, its walls vibrating with the low murmur of anticipation. Students, professors, judges, and everyday citizens had gathered shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the woman standing at the podium. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gripped its edges lightly, not out of nerves but out of intent, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces lit by soft overhead lights. Her voice carried, strong yet intimate, drawing every ear closer. "The Constitution is not words on paper. It's the people who dare to speak." A ripple went through the room, heads nodding, eyes sharpening as if each syllable peeled back layers of disillusionment and replaced them with purpose. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink into the collective consciousness before leaning slightly forward. "Speak, speak, speak." Each repetition came not as a plea, but as a command, a heartbeat that pulsed in every chest in the room. Justice Sotomayor sat near the front, her hands folded in her lap, her face softened by the glow of the stage lights. There was no trace of the stern detachment she once wore in the courtroom. Instead, her eyes glistened, reflecting both humility and a quiet sense of transformation. She whispered so faintly only those seated closest could hear, "Point taken." It wasn't an admission of defeat, It was an acknowledgement of something far larger than either of them, something both fragile and unyielding. As AOC stepped back from the podium, her eyes lingered on the crowd. For a moment, silence stretched, thick with the weight of possibility. Then one person rose to their feet, clapping slowly but with determination. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was standing, applause thundering through the hall like a rolling storm. It wasn't the polite clapping of obligation. It was raw, unrestrained, a sound that carried gratitude, defiance, and hope all at once. The noise seemed to press against the walls as if trying to break them open, to spill this energy out into the streets beyond. AOC's gaze didn't falter as she descended from the stage, her steps measured, her expression resolute yet touched with emotion. Around her, the clapping didn't subside. It only grew, wave after wave, until it felt less like applause and more like a collective vow. And as she walked down the aisle past rows of people on their feet, a single thought echoed louder than the thunderous hands. This is what power sounds like when it finally listens. Justice doesn't live in marble halls. It lives in you. But here's the real question. Will you awaken it before silence buries us all? The Constitution won't save your voice. It dares you to save it yourself. If the world went silent tomorrow, would your voice be the one they remember? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.